When someone claims to have authority, what makes us believe them? Is it their confidence, their charisma, or is it because they say exactly what we want to hear? History is full of people who gained followers not by proving their credibility, but by making big, unverifiable claims, whether it was divine visions, miraculous signs, or promises of power and salvation. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for the 5th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle C, we're going to look beyond the traditional Christian narrative to uncover a few lessons that should resonate with all of us, regardless of our religious background or lack thereof. In this episode, we'll be taking a close look at what it means to earn trust, from Isaiah's vision of divine selection to Paul's rather circular reasoning about Jesus' resurrection, to the moment Jesus recruits his first disciples. We see a pattern. Credibility in these stories often rests on the supernatural. But in the real world, that's not enough. So how do we decide who is actually worth following? How do we recognize real leadership, the kind that stands up to scrutiny? And how do we make sure we're not just accepting claims at face value, whether they come from the pulpit, the political stage, or the latest viral influencer? Tonight we'll explore why true credibility is built on actions, integrity, and evidence, not just on words. So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for the 5th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle C of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't demand a belief in the supernatural. What that means, from a practical standpoint, is that we will assume that these readings and writings are fiction, written by pre-scientific people who were trying to make sense of the universe. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, but I encourage you to look for something that rings true to you. Part of the beauty of understanding these writings as sacred myths is that we're free to interpret them for ourselves. We're free to learn the lessons that we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for the 5th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle C. Our first reading is from Isaiah. It's chapter 6, verses 1 through 2a, and verses 3 through 8. Our second reading is from the first letter to the Corinthians. It's chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, and verse 11. And our gospel reading is from Luke. It's chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. Now, we will start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one, and finally bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from the prophet Isaiah. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings, and they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. Our second reading was from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Whether then it is I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believed. And our gospel reading is from Luke. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats, left there by the fishermen, who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he had said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. All right, so let's go back and take a bit of a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from Isaiah. And in this reading, we saw Isaiah's vision, which is a classic example of what's called a prophetic call narrative. You see, in ancient times, stories like this were meant to establish a prophet's authority. The idea was pretty simple. If a person claimed to speak for God, then people needed to believe they had been divinely chosen. In Isaiah's case, the story includes this dramatic vision of a seraphim and a symbolic cleansing ritual to prove his worthiness. But let's be honest, there's no evidence that this actually happened. Isaiah was a deeply superstitious man in a deeply superstitious time. And actually, Isaiah was probably several prophets over the course of decades, maybe centuries. But his belief in divine selection was a product of the culture, not some objective proof of his credibility. Today, we don't need to claim divine authority to advocate for a cause. And we certainly shouldn't accept unverified claims from others. Credibility isn't something that should be assumed. It should be earned. Whether someone is speaking about religion, politics, or any other significant issue, we should always ask, what makes this person credible? What evidence supports their claim? Too often, people will rely on borrowed authority, claiming that a higher power or even just their own intuition gives them the right to lead. Or they'll claim that I've had success in this other area, which means that I'm an expert in this unrelated area. They're borrowing authority. But if someone's only proof of credibility is their own insistence, why should we trust them? This matters because the blind acceptance of unverified claims has very real consequences. It's easy to see this pattern in religion, but it has also crept into politics. Leaders make grand promises, assert that they have been called to positions of power, and they expect people to follow them without question. And far too often, People do, without asking for proof, without demanding accountability. If we want a just and rational society, we need to hold everyone to a higher standard. Everyone, especially people who claim leadership roles. Credibility isn't about divine selection or personal conviction. It's about evidence, experience, and integrity. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that we should only accept well-established credibility. Isaiah believed he had to prove that God had chosen him. Today, we prove our credibility through our actions, our knowledge, and our integrity. And just as we expect others to demonstrate their credibility, we should be mindful of how we establish our own. We should never accept leadership, authority, or expertise without scrutiny. The question isn't who claims to be called. The question is who has actually earned the right to be heard. Because at the end of the day, we should only accept well-established credibility. So our second reading was from the first letter to the Corinthians. And in this reading, Paul's message that we find in this passage it's essentially a kind of an early Christian recap, a quick summary of the core beliefs about Jesus' resurrection, at least in regards to Paul and the communities he was active in. But what stands out is how he attempts to prove it. He lists various people who allegedly saw the resurrected Jesus as if that solidifies the claim. The problem is that there is no contemporary non-biblical documentation to support any of it. If a man had truly risen from the dead and appeared to over 500 people, historians of the time would have written about it extensively. But they didn't. And yet Paul presents this list as if it should settle the matter. This approach isn't unique to Paul. It was a key strategy of early Christianity. These early believers, they were desperate to make their new movement seem more credible. So they scoured Jewish scriptures to find anything they could frame as a prophecy of Jesus' death and resurrection. This was really the original proof texting, taking ancient religious texts out of context and claiming they validated new supernatural beliefs. And it worked, not because it provided real evidence, but because it borrowed the authority of an already established religious tradition. The logic was circular. Our story is true because the old writings predicted it, and we know they predicted it because we say our story is true, I guess. But here's the thing. Using one myth to validate another myth doesn't make either one of them credible. We see this pattern over and over in religious traditions. Claims stacked on top of other claims, each one propped up by the assumption that the previous claim was true. This isn't a foundation for truth. It's more of a house of cards. If we're going to believe in something, it shouldn't be because an old story says so. It should be because there's real, tangible evidence, testable evidence, to back it up. So the main lesson I got from our second reading is that using mythological claims to prove mythological claims doesn't make them true. Early Christians wanted to prove their claims, so they leaned on ancient texts and self-referential testimonies. But that doesn't make their stories any more factual. If something is true, it should stand on its own merits, not on the borrowed authority of older myths. And if we want to build a worldview based on truth, we have to demand more than circular reasoning. We need real evidence, because at the end of the day, using mythological claims to prove mythological claims doesn't make them true. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of Luke, and in this version of the story, Luke gives a slightly different take on how Simon Peter became a follower of Jesus. Unlike other accounts, where it seems like Simon immediately drops everything and follows, This passage suggests it wasn't a snap decision. It was the result of a longer process. And that makes sense. People don't usually abandon their entire lives after one conversation. But what's most interesting here is the way Jesus allegedly wins Simon over through a miracle, right? This overwhelming catch of fish. This supernatural element is meant to establish Jesus' divine authority. But let's be real. Jesus could have simply been a compelling speaker and leader. Why not just say that? Well, because in the world of mythology, leaders don't persuade with logic and reason. They prove their authority with miracles. The idea behind this passage is that God is always seeking out followers, not the other way around. Jesus tells Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." And of course, Simon, when he was feeling unworthy, he had said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." The point the author was making is, I think it's pretty clear. Humans don't choose God. God chooses humans. That seems to be the point here. But if we strip away this supernatural framing, we're left with something much more practical. Every leader, religious or otherwise, is ultimately trying to gain followers. Whether it's a spiritual leader, a political figure, or even an activist for a cause, the goal is the same. Convince people to trust and follow you. And that brings us to the real takeaway here. In reality, leaders don't gain followers through miraculous signs. They do it by being someone worth following. People follow those who inspire them, who demonstrate integrity, who lead by example. Author John Maxwell put it rather bluntly. He said, "He who thinks he leads but has no followers is only taking a walk." We see people today who claim divine authority, who insist that they've been called to lead, but a title or a claim isn't enough, and it will only get you so far and last so long. If you want to lead, if you truly want to lead people, you have to earn trust, prove your credibility, and then continue to demonstrate real value. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that if you want to lead, be worth following. Jesus didn't gain followers just because he claimed divine status. He connected with people. He inspired them and gave them a vision to rally around. That's what real leaders do. And if we want to be people who influence and guide others, whether in small ways or big ones, we have to ask ourselves, are we worth following? Leadership isn't about demanding obedience or impressing people with grand claims. It's about proving, through action, that we deserve to lead. Because at the end of the day, if you want to lead, be worth following. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Isaiah, the main lesson I came away with was we should only accept well-established credibility. In our second reading from 1 Corinthians, the main lesson I got was using mythological claims to prove mythological claims doesn't make them true. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was if you want to lead, be worth following. Not everyone who claims authority actually deserves to have it. Whether it's a politician, a religious leader, or an influencer trying to sell you something, real credibility isn't just declared, it's demonstrated. We've seen how ancient prophets, early Christian leaders, and even Jesus himself had to convince people they were worth listening to. But too often, their credibility rested on supernatural claims instead of real-world evidence. Today, we have the advantage of knowing better. We don't need to rely on myths, visions, or divine callings to determine who deserves our trust. True leaders don't claim they're chosen. They show us through their actions that they're worth following. And if someone can't back up their authority with real-world proof, well, then they don't deserve that authority. And they certainly don't deserve to have us as followers. Because any good, True leaders should be able to establish their credibility with real-world evidence, not unverifiable supernatural claims. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these messages and lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what and now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this because we live in a world where authority is often claimed, not earned. From politicians to religious leaders to social media influencers, we are constantly surrounded by people who expect us to trust them without providing real proof that they deserve it. And that's a problem. When we don't demand evidence and ongoing support to back that up, when we let emotions or blind loyalty guide us instead of reason, we set ourselves up to be manipulated. Too many people have been conditioned by religion to accept exaggerated claims without question. If something makes them feel inspired or validated, they'll believe it, no matter how little proof there is to support it. And the deeper they go, the harder it becomes to question, because admitting they were wrong would mean admitting they've been fooled. And nobody likes to admit that. This is important because we need real leaders, leaders who earn our trust through competence, through honesty, and through results, not through empty rhetoric or unverifiable supernatural claims. Strong leadership isn't about confidence or charisma alone. It's about actual skill. It's about experience and integrity. If someone claims that they're the best, well, they need to prove it. If they boast about their victories, those victories need to stand up to scrutiny. And that means we, as a society, need to be better at scrutinizing. Blind faith, whether in religion or politics, leads to exploitation, corruption, and very dangerous consequences. We should care about this because those who are already deep into blind loyalty often think they are scrutinizing. And that's a difficult challenge we have to figure out how to overcome. They may feel like they're carefully evaluating claims when in reality they're just reinforcing what they already believe. That's why those of us who aren't caught up in this cycle have to step up. We have to be the ones who demand accountability, who push for more transparency, and who challenge the idea that faith, whether in God or in a political figure, faith should never override facts. If we don't, then the people who do follow blindly will continue to hand power to those who least deserve it. And we can't afford to keep doing that. And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Where do we go from here? Well, it's easy to assume we can tell the difference between trustworthy leaders and those who just claim to be worthy of our trust. But the truth is, many people fall into the trap of following strong personalities rather than strong principles. Whether it's a religious leader, a politician, or even an influencer, we need to be intentional about evaluating why we trust certain people and what evidence we actually have to support that trust. If we're serious about demanding credibility from others, we first need to ask ourselves, are we really using logic and evidence to determine who we follow? Or are we just following what we want to believe? So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. Who is a leader you trust, and why do you trust them? Think of a leader, past or present, who you trust or admire. Why? Why do you trust them? What specific, tangible evidence do you have that proves their credibility? Do they show consistent integrity, competence, and accountability? Or do they just tell a compelling story that feels true? We often don't realize how much emotion influences our perception of credibility. When someone aligns with our beliefs or says what we want to hear, we're more likely to give them a pass, even if their track record doesn't actually support their claims. Taking the time to break down why we trust someone forces us to separate facts from feelings. And that's critical because in a world full of self-proclaimed experts and chosen leaders, blind trust is dangerous. By learning to demand real proof of credibility, we sharpen our ability to make informed choices, not just about leadership, but about everything that shapes our lives. A little over 20 years ago, I was working for Delphi Automotive Systems. I'd been working for General Motors when they spun off their automotive parts divisions into a single standalone company. At the time of the spinoff, it was a massive company. We were a $35 billion global company with factories around the world. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for an automotive parts company that was paying GM wages and benefits to start to feel the pain of the competition. I think we started with close to 40 factories in the U.S., and by the time the restructuring was done, we were going to be left with less than 10. It was a difficult time, and I remember talking to colleagues and saying things like, it's difficult, but it happens in business. The company leaders, they don't want to close these factories. They've made that clear, but we need to do it in order to get competitive. I mean, they're human too. They certainly don't enjoy doing this. And that was my basic stance on all of the restructurings and these painful plant closings, until I was assigned as the HR liaison to the Delphi Strategy Board. The Strategy Board was made up of about a dozen, I guess, of these top executives, the executive vice presidents of the various divisions, the CIO, folks like that. Now, the CEO never actually showed up, at least not the meetings that I was called to, but all of the other big shots were there. And my job was to sit quietly in the corner, certainly not at the table, definitely not at the table, sit in the corner, and then just before the end of the meeting, they gave me about 2 minutes to do an update on headcount reductions and a couple other HR things. But for the first 58 minutes of the meeting, I was invisible to those high-paid executives, and they talked freely. Meeting after meeting, I sat there horrified while they joked and laughed about closing more factories, about sticking it to the union, about those lazy bastards getting what they deserved, the unemployment line. There was no compassion at all. Zero, zilch, none. In fact, there was almost nothing but this sense of evil glee. That's what it felt like. These weren't human beings, not according to what I believed it meant to be human. And then it came time to hand out the performance bonus letters. And each of us HR reps were given a large envelope with a stack of letters for the staff we serviced. And we were expected to hand deliver them if they were in the same complex, or send them via interoffice mail if they weren't. So I opened my envelope and quickly looked through them to make sure they were all my folks and that I knew where everyone was. And it was interesting to see the various bonus amounts. Mine was about $1,600 that year. I remember that. I was 7th level, and a couple of the 8th level folks had bonuses that were like 3 or 4 times that amount. Whoa, except for one. I didn't know who the person was, and I thought it was a typo. So I took it to my supervisor, and she freaked out. She grabbed it from me and whispered, "Don't tell anyone you saw this. You're not supposed to see this. Only the director and I see the executive performance bonuses." Well, I had remembered the person's name, so I looked her up later. She was just some mid-level executive, nowhere near as high up the ladder as those evil executive vice presidents on the strategy board. And yet her performance bonus that year was over $160,000. It was 100 times what I received. It was more than twice my salary. Her bonus. We were closing factories left and right and rewarding the executives who were doing it. In the grand scheme of things, closing all of those factories, Who knows? May have been the right business choice. Delphi ended up in bankruptcy a few years later, along with GM, but Delphi didn't really survive. There's not much left. But the fact is that I learned not to simply trust what our leaders were saying. I learned not to simply take it all at face value, because not everyone is a decent person. In fact, many of them are downright bad people. And they're the ones who will lie, cheat, and steal in order to gain and maintain power. So this week, challenge yourself. Pick a leader you admire. Break down the reasons why you trust him, and see if the evidence holds up. If it does, great. Now you know why you trust him. If it doesn't, it might be time to rethink that trust. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. The famous horror and suspense writer Stephen King once said, "The trust of the innocent is the liar's most useful tool." Trust is a powerful thing. When we place our faith, our trust in someone, whether a leader, a mentor, or even a public figure, we're giving them influence over how we see the world. But as Stephen King points out, trust without scrutiny can be dangerous. Liars, manipulators, frauds, they depend on people trusting them blindly. They need us to believe their words without looking for evidence, because if we actually checked, we might realize there ain't nothing there. And that brings us right back to this week's question. How do we know who actually deserves our trust? Are we basing our belief in someone on solid proof? On their track record, their consistency, and their integrity? Or are we just having faith in them because they say the things we want to hear? The good news is that trust doesn't have to be blind. You can protect yourself. We can protect our communities and even our democracy by demanding credibility, by making sure those we trust have earned that trust. Because at the end of the day, the best leaders don't just ask for our confidence. They prove time and time again that they are worthy of it. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week, but in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week. And pay attention to any important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for the 5th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle C of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that any good, true leader should be able to establish their credibility with real-world evidence, not unverifiable supernatural claims. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc., used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you again for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find both the podcast and the video versions of the presentations at thecodaproject.com. CODA stands for Creating Our Divine Alignment. When we learn to align our words and actions with our core values, that alignment feels absolutely exquisite. It feels divine. But it's a divine alignment that doesn't require belief in the supernatural. It's a divine alignment we have the ability to create for ourselves. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the CODA Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.